Okay, so welcome to the first of the parallel sessions for today. My name's Michaelis Bradley. I'm going to be chairing this, and I'm going to be ruling with an iron fist. I'm going to stick to those rules that Helen laid down in the booklet. It's my pleasure to introduce Michaelis Michael, talking about Lewis and the nature of logical space. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll just power on then. In outline, the paper's going to look like this: space of possible worlds, space of possibilities, ways things could have been, ways things would not have been. But I tell you what, I'm actually going to skip those two because the time is of the essence, and I'm going to jump to necessity and a priori. And then I'll talk about the objection to Lewis's reductionism from necessity a posteriori, and I'll talk a bit about Lewis's own response to this objection. He has a quick response and a longer response, and I'll take them in sequence. Okay, so about necessity and a posteriority. The distinction between these was made by Morton White in the early days. He made it as a conceptual distinction while treating them as extensionally equivalent. And he recognized the necessity was a metaphysical notion. He recognized a priori was an epistemic notion. It was Kripke who came along and said, not only do we have different concepts here, but they actually differ in extension. And he provided examples of necessity a posteriori, such as Hesperus is phosphorus, or humans are made of atoms, and possibly the contingent a priori, such as the meter rule case, and I'll go into that a bit more detail, but also examples like cats exist if and only if actually cats exist. So let me skip to Lewis's a priori reductionism. He says that my reductionism about mind begins as part of an a priori reductionism about everything. This world, or any possible world, consists of things which instantiate fundamental properties and which in pairs or triples or whatever instantiate fundamental relations. Now, what exactly is this a priori reductionism? Does it really mean that it's a priori that pain is C if C happens to realize the pain function? Well, no, not quite, but it is a priori according to David Lewis, and here he was influenced, I think, by Frank Jackson, that the totality of physical information about the world, assuming that's the most fundamental level description of the world, a priori entailed that, for example, Bernard is in pain or Bernard is thinking of Vienna. And to do that, we're actually allowed to use all the a priori truths too, and crucially, the ones that specify the functional roles to be filled. Now, according to an objection that Lewis considers, which is close to one from Frank, suppose that the world is wholly physically constituted. Could there be a truth about the mental facts constituted by the underlying physical facts, which is not entailed by those physical facts? Well, one response might be, well, those physical facts might necessitate the mental facts without doing so a priori. I'm getting an echo, so I'm taking the headphones off. Another stronger response is that the physical facts can constitute the mental facts without even necessitating them. And it's the first of these two objections that Lewis is actually responding to. Let's now move to the short reply. Cool. So his short reply to this objection is in the paper, The Reduction of Mind. I'll be talking mostly about this paper. The short reply is that if it did show that the mental was irreducible to fundamental physics, it would likewise show that boiling was irreducible to fundamental physics, which is absurd, for the identity of boiling in a certain process described in fundamental physical terms is necessary a posteriori, if anything is. So the reply Lewis makes then is that the only way to deny that the mental reduces will commit you to something unacceptable, denying that boiling also reduces. Well, I want to give a quick rejoinder to this objection. Remember, the idea is that if you had boiling, a claim like boiling made the whistle blow, or John leaned forward to better hear Lloyd, these two sentences are both causally implicating sentences, and roughly it's that the boiling of the water in the kettle causes the whistles blowing, and John's belief that he will hear better if he leans forward was part of the causal story of his leaning. And so far, this is exactly the way Lewis would put it. So roughly, it's saying that if the water hadn't boiled, then the whistle wouldn't have blown, or if John hadn't believed as he did, he would not have leaned forward. So what's involved in the former, the boiling of the water? Well, what's involved is that there are various counterparts of the water's boiling, and all of them arguably constituted by water boiling. However, not all of John's counterparts need to be wholly physically constituted. Some of his belief counterparts will be partially spooky stuff. Here I'm actually taking my inspiration from David's paper, Counterparts of Persons and Their Bodies, where he insists that the counterpart relation on persons need not be the same as the counterpart relation on their bodies. And that persons can have counterpart relations that are not wholly physical, whereas their bodies cannot have that. So again, what matters about John's beliefs and their causes is what happens with the counterparts. And it's open to us to hold that despite John in our world being wholly physically constituted, that his beliefs are not identical to his present physical constitution, since the beliefs are identified by their causal character, and those can take in other counterparts which are non-physical, and how those other counterparts behave. So despite the counterparts of water boiling being other ways that water boils, the counterparts of John's belief can involve non-physical stuff. So contrary to that quick, short objection of David's, that if you deny the reducibility of the mental to the physical, then you must deny the reducibility of boiling. This provides a reason for thinking that we can distinguish these two cases in terms of what the counterparts are going to be like. And in any case, it shows that the short response is way too quick. I should say quickly, this is an objection that I did discuss with David when I was a student of his way back when. Okay, so here's the longer reply that David makes. The longer reply is, as he puts it, is founded on, following Jackson, founded on the two-dimensional analysis of necessity a posteriori. And at that point, he refers to the usual suspects. And he says two-dimensionalism says there's no such thing as a necessary a posteriori proposition. However, one single sentence F may be associated in two different ways with two different propositions, one of them necessary and the other contingent. And the contingent one can be known only a posteriori, excuse me. The crucial thing to note here is that according to David, that two-dimensionalism says there's no such thing as a necessary a posteriori proposition. Now, this is at least contentious, even understood in David's way as a set of worlds. Let me just quickly illustrate what the two-dimensional story looks like. For some interpreted sentence, fully interpreted sentence S, we have a matrix like this. Now, we have the context of utterance down the left-hand side and the index according to which we assess them on the top. So as uttered in world 1, the sentence S is assigned a proposition which is true just in world 1 and world 2. As uttered in world 2, sentence S expresses a proposition which is true in world 1, 2, and 3 only. As uttered in world 3, it's true in world 1 and world 3. And as uttered in world 4, it's true just in world 4. Now, the crucial thing to note is that as uttered in those 4 worlds, it expresses distinct proposition in each. It need not. But in none of them does it express a necessary proposition. However, the diagonal, if you think about what happens to the sentence as it's expressed in world 1, it's true in that world. As uttered in world 2, it's true in that world. As uttered in world 3, etc. You get a necessary diagonal, a row of T's on the diagonal there. So that is what it is for a sentence to be assigned a necessary diagonal. It's that it's always true in a world when uttered in that world. And the idea of two-dimensionalism is that those interpreted sentences with a necessary proposition as their diagonal are all and only the a priori truths. That's the interpretation that some have given. I should say, although this is hugely influenced by Bob Stallmacher's view, that is not Bob's view. Bob Stallmacher has reiterated that he sees this as a simple model that really isn't giving an account of the a priori. And David's own twist on this was to say that that in a context we can deploy a sentence to express either the horizontal or the diagonal. And in the case above, that horizontal propositions are one and all of them contingent. They need not be, but they happen to be in the example that I used. But the diagonal is itself necessary. And this allows him to deny that any interpreted sentence is both contingent and a priori. And what I want to do now is, in the 5 minutes I have left, cast doubt on that denial. So is it true that no contingent proposition or set of worlds can be known a priori? I want to argue that no, it's not true. And in fact, what we should say is that there's no conceptual relation between the set of worlds, where the set of worlds is the set of all worlds, or just a partial set of worlds, and the ways that we come to know that proposition. And interestingly, after I proved some results in two-dimensional modal logic like this, David pointed me to Leslie Tharp's results, which were indeed quite general and of the same character. And I think this is these works, these theorems in metaphysics, as the paper by Tharp, should be much, much better known. As I say, David pointed me towards these results. So these are there are sentences I want to argue that express contingent propositions that we can come to know a priori, and there are sentences that express necessary propositions that we can only know a posteriori. Notice I'm not talking about propositions here. It's about the sentences. It's better to say that it's not the propositions themselves that are a priori or a posteriori. The propositions are simply sets of worlds. It's interpreted sentences that where the action is. Anyway, to see all this, we need to see the limitations of this two-dimensional analysis of the a priori. It's a very influential picture. A lot of people have just taken it for granted, but I think it's a woefully inadequate account of the a priori. The first point, when I say that it's an inadequate analysis, that's not to say that there are no insights in it, that we can't glean some information about the ways that different concepts relate to each other, necessity and a priori. And also, it may well be that it gives the right sort of analysis for some of the examples of the contingent a priori, in particular, examples like I am here now. The second point I want to make is that the analysis is that sentences get associated with distinct semantic contents, those sets of words or propositions, relative to a context. So let's now define a sentence H to mean that Australia wins the 2019 ICC One Day International World Cup if they do. And it means the same as 2 + 2 = 5 if they don't. Now, we're actually in a position to know that H. It's, but arguably we don't know which proposition is expressed by H. Well, at least that's not clear yet. We do know that the sentence H is true. And that sentence is a sentence of our language. And so by semantic descent, arguably, we know that H. You might balk at this. You might notice, you might say, we don't really know. We know the sentence is true, but we don't know that H. But I would say that, in fact, we've narrowed it down to 2 propositions. And most of the time, we're hard-pressed to find any way of uniquely specifying without circularity the propositions our sentences express. And here, you might want to consider, as an example of this, the meter stick case. Now, the dubber takes a certain stick S and says stick S is a meter long, and thereby dubbing its length as 1 meter. Well, which length? There's a bunch of different lengths that you're not in a position, or even the dubber's not in a position to distinguish. And yet we're happy to say that it's true that the stick S is a meter long. And moreover, we've brought a full semantic content into being, allowing us to use the term 1 meter by that act. I should say, in the literature, there's a very influential mistake made by Gareth Evans at this point. And that is that he thought that Kripke suggested that the sentence used in the dubbing, S is 1 meter long, is generally a priori. In fact, he makes a point of saying that that a sentence has one epistemic status across the language, a priori or a posteriori. This is clearly a mistake. It's a mistake that Kripke thought this. He never says this, but it's also a mistake to think that a sentence has a status as a priori or a posteriori across the language. And let me just sort of quickly explain why. That sentence, S is a meter long, could be false a moment later. Someone might have stepped on S. Someone could have stretched S. When we're using an object as a reference for a magnitude, we take steps to assure ourselves that it doesn't change in that magnitude. But that sentence did not change its meaning. And it's because it means the same thing that it can be known a priori at the dubbing and could be false later. And so if it's true, is only a posteriori true. So a story that makes the empirical status of a sentence a relationship to a distinct semantic contents gets this wrong. And the same sentence can be a priori in one context with a dubber and a posteriori for the same person or for any other person in another context. The third point to make is that diagonal proposition is just another proposition, another set of worlds. And actually, David was big on this. This is why he liked the two-dimensional story. The theory that a priori is the necessity of the diagonal has, because of that, a very important unattractive consequence. The distinction between those sentences with necessary diagonals and those with contingent diagonals partitions the sentences. And we can allow for those with necessary false diagonals to count as necessary for this purpose. But in any case, it partitions the fully interpreted sentences. The distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori is actually a distinction among the knowable truths. But if it's truths that we're considering, these concepts, the a posteriori knowable and the a posteriori knowable, are not concepts that partition the truths, since there are unknowable truths. And that means that the theory that the a priori coincides with the necessity of the diagonal, and that the a posteriori coincides with the contingency of the diagonal, misses that crucial epistemic aspect of the concept. What this tells us, roughly, is that we can't do everything with the same space of possible worlds. We have to build the epistemic story in somewhere. So what you might say, they get the a priori wrong, what's the big deal? The functional roles can still be specified in a priori manner. They can still be used to facilitate the a priori reduction. Well, no, that doesn't work. And you can see that again from the meter stick sentence. The sentence, stick S is 1 meter long, is not in general a priori. It's a priori when used to dub, but it's not a priori even for the dubber later on. And the 2D approach misses this. But it misses that, it means that there won't be these a priori functional specifications in general. And that means that the a priori reductionism will fail. Okay, that gets me to the conclusion. David was committed to a wholesale extensionalism that pervades his philosophy and gives it a coherence and systematicity that's close to unrivaled. And one way that manifests is the doctrine that composition is identity. And that doctrine is contentious and seems at odds with our ordinary ways of understanding things. That's from the short reply. And it's also at odds with David's modally rich conception of defining the functional states of roles of states. And if there were not the a priori story specifying the functional roles, then there's no prospect of a priori reductionism. Thank you.